She stood 5 feet 6 inches tall, but everyone who met her swore she was taller. Back straight as a blade, chin level, eyes fixed somewhere in the middle distance, refusing, absolutely refusing, to be affected by anything external. That was Queen Mary as the public knew her. The toques, the pearls 5 strands deep, the brooches so enormous they seemed less like jewelry and more like armor plating. She didn't follow fashion. Fashion was irrelevant to her. She'd found her form by about 1910, and she held it year after year, decade after decade, until the nation learned to read that immovable silhouette as stability itself. The press used words like dignity and duty. The BBC called her the grandmother of the nation. Pathé newsreels carried her image into cinemas across the empire, and what those flickering frames showed was a woman who appeared to have been carved rather than born. She moved through crowds with a slow, deliberate gait, acknowledging greetings with a minimal inclination of the head. Never a wave, never a grin, never anything so vulgar as enthusiasm. Just presence. Colossal, immovable presence. But here's the thing. Carved things don't have staff. Queen Mary did. And when a biographer named James Pope-Hennessy finally went looking for the private woman behind the monument, interviewing the people who'd actually served her, actually dressed her, actually stood at her door, what he found was a portrait the public was never meant to see. Pope-Hennessy, born in 1916, was an elegant writer and a careful listener, and he understood that these conversations were a kind of archaeology, sifting through layers of deference and discretion to find the human bedrock beneath. The notes from those interviews sat unpublished for decades after his official biography, Queen Mary, appeared in 1959. That book was authorized, polished, smoothed at the edges. The raw notes stayed in a drawer. Pope-Hennessy was murdered in 1974, a separate tragedy, a separate story entirely. But the notes survived, and in 2018, Hugo Vickers finally edited them into a book called The Quest for Queen Mary. 65 years after she died. That's how long the servants waited, and what those notes contained was the testimony of people who'd kept their mouths shut for a very long time. Some of what they said was measured, careful, diplomatic even. Some of it wasn't. The assessments from those closest to her daily routine, her security detail, her household attendants, the people who occupied the invisible architecture of her life, were, as one associate later acknowledged, not the sort of thing you'd repeat in polite company. The word that keeps surfacing across multiple accounts is sour. As sour in private as she looked in her most forbidding photographs. And the people who used that word weren't bitter ex-employees grinding axes. They were professionals who'd served for years, performed their duties immaculately, and received in return something that wasn't cruelty, exactly. It was worse than cruelty in some ways. It was absence. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand what that absence felt like from the service corridor, you have to start where Queen Mary started. In a cramped cottage on the Sandringham estate, with 6 children she couldn't quite reach. York Cottage was a strange place to raise a royal family. A warren of small rooms, poorly suited to the household that grew rapidly between 1894 and 1905. 6 children in 11 years. Edward arrived in June 1894, Albert in December 1895, Mary in April 1897, Henry in March 1900, George in December 1902, and John in July 1905. The nursery staff worked in quarters so close that privacy was a fiction. They moved through corridors that forced them past the family's private rooms. They heard things through walls that were never thick enough. They saw everything. And what they saw was a mother whose emotional register simply didn't include warmth. Not cruelty, no shouting, No punishment beyond what the Edwardian era considered perfectly ordinary. What the household witnessed was something harder to name and considerably harder to watch. A woman who could spend an hour reviewing a child's progress with a governess and never once touch the child being discussed. The children were brought to Queen Mary. She didn't go to them. They were presented at appointed times, inspected against expected standards, and returned to the care of nannies and governesses who occupied the functional role that, in other families, a mother might have filled. Meals, lessons, walks, bedtimes, everything proceeded on a schedule that accommodated the parents' convenience rather than the children's needs. And the staff who carried meals and made beds and heard the children at night understood this arrangement, in their bones, long before any biographer committed it to print. Mabel, Countess of Airlie, perhaps Queen Mary's closest female friend across a relationship spanning decades, served as a lady-in-waiting and eventually published her memoir, Thatched with Gold, in 1962. She recorded a moment of extraordinary candor. Queen Mary once confided to her that she'd found it impossible to express her feelings to her children. Just sit with that for a second. Not unwilling, impossible. She used that word, or something very close to it, with her most intimate friend. The woman knew something was missing. She could see the gap between herself and her children as clearly as anyone looking in from the outside. She simply couldn't cross it. Didn't know how to cross it. The nursery staff described this not with outrage, but with a quiet, unsettled sadness. The sadness of people who'd watched a kind of emotional starvation unfold in rooms furnished with every material comfort imaginable. The children had everything, except the one thing children need most. And the servants who lived alongside them knew it with a certainty that no amount of professional discretion could entirely suppress. The Duke of Windsor, writing in his 1951 memoir, A King's Story, described a mother whose emotional vocabulary didn't contain the grammar of comfort. She didn't embrace easily. She didn't console instinctively. She loved her children. People who knew her well seemed reasonably certain of that. But she expressed it through expectation rather than tenderness, through the enforcement of standards rather than the offering of warmth. That distinction matters. It's the difference between a mother who won't hold you and a mother who can't. The staff saw both versions of that sentence playing out in the same house, and they couldn't always tell which was which. Nobody could. And then there was John. Prince John suffered from epilepsy. In 1917, at 12 years old, he was moved to Wood Farm on the Sandringham estate to live separately from the family, under the devoted care of his nanny, Charlotte Bill. For the remaining 2 years of his life, he occupied a world apart, visited occasionally by his parents, loved daily by servants who became, in all practical respects, his family. Charlotte Bill knew his seizures, his moods, his small pleasures, the particular way his face changed when he was happy. She knew him the way a mother knows a child, because she'd been given the space that his actual mother couldn't fill. John died in January 1919. He was 13. Queen Mary's diary entry recorded the event with her characteristic composed brevity, the same restrained shorthand she brought to all matters of personal feeling. A few lines, controlled, complete. The Sandringham staff who'd cared for John every day formed their own views about what this arrangement, the separation, the delegation, the quiet tucking away of a child who didn't fit the family's public image, revealed about the woman they served. They didn't express those views publicly, not then, but the views were held. They were remembered, carried in silence through years of continued service. And years later, when Pope-Hennessy came with his notebook and his gentle, persistent questions, those views hadn't softened, not even slightly. So that's the mother. Now consider the queen consort, because when George V acceded to the throne on the 6th of May 1910, the transformation was total. The shy, emotionally locked woman from York Cottage began constructing a public monument in human form, and she built it to last. Those toques, the distinctive, high, ornamental hats that sat atop her carefully dressed hair like upholstered crowns, became her visual signature. She wore them in every season, at every function, in configurations that varied only in color and trimming, but never in fundamental architecture. The ropes of pearls, multiple strands at a time, sometimes 5, sometimes 6, layer upon layer, cascading down from her collar in a display that managed to be simultaneously ornamental and defensive. The brooches that could blind you from across a ballroom. The entire silhouette, from the top of the toque to the hem of a skirt that never rose above the ankle, was constructed with the deliberateness of a fortress being built against the world. She didn't smile in photographs, not because she was told not to, because it didn't occur to her that smiling was part of the arrangement. And behind the closed doors of Buckingham Palace, where the public couldn't follow, the staff experienced a woman whose demands were fierce, exacting, and at times, genuinely bewildering. Queen Mary didn't shout. That's important to establish early, because the kind of difficulty she presented was not the kind that makes noise. Multiple household members described this with remarkable consistency when Pope-Hennessy came asking. What she did was withdraw. A tightening of the mouth, a cooling of the gaze, a quality of attention that shifted from acknowledgement to something closer to erasure. You hadn't been reprimanded, you hadn't been corrected, you'd been disappeared. And you'd stay disappeared until she decided, on her schedule and no one else's, that you'd suffered enough. A maid who placed something incorrectly might find that Queen Mary simply wouldn't look at her for the remainder of the day. Not a glance, not a flicker of recognition. An entire human being, standing 3 feet away, rendered invisible by the withdrawal of a queen's attention. A footman who committed some minor breach of protocol, a door opened a half-second late, a tray presented from the wrong side, would discover he'd been erased from her field of perception entirely. Spoken past, looked through, reduced to a functional absence that continued until she decided, privately, that the correction had been absorbed. For people whose entire professional existence depended on being of service, this withdrawal of acknowledgement was a punishment of extraordinary psychological precision. It left no evidence, required no confrontation, could not be appealed. You couldn't apologize for something that had never been openly identified as wrong. You simply had to endure the frost and wait. Lady Cynthia Colville, who served as a lady-in-waiting during the consort years, walked a careful line between loyalty and honesty in her later observations. She described a woman who was deeply shy, and this characterization recurs across so many testimonies that it can't be dismissed as excuse-making, but whose shyness had calcified over decades of public life into something that looked, from the receiving end, indistinguishable from coldness. Queen Mary couldn't do small talk. She couldn't put people at ease. She'd never learned, or never been willing to learn, the small social graces that oil human interaction, and in their absence, every encounter carried a weight and a formality that left people drained. Even Mabel Airlie, who genuinely loved her, acknowledged there was a wall, not hostility, constitutional reserve, a wall that nobody, perhaps not even George V himself, had ever fully penetrated. The staff below the level of the ladies-in-waiting were considerably less diplomatic. They described a woman whose manner was imperious, whose standards were impossible, and whose capacity for gratitude was essentially non-existent. You won't find in these accounts the warmth of a servant looking back fondly on a demanding but beloved employer. What you find is the testimony of people who performed brilliantly for years and received in return not cruelty, but nothing. An absence of acknowledgement, of warmth, of the basic human recognition that someone had done something well. the staff were instruments. They performed functions. When they performed correctly, nothing was said. When they didn't, the silence was surgical. There was no middle ground, no well done, no nod of approval. Just the binary, invisible compliance or visible erasure. Her dressers, the women who helped her into those elaborate, unchanging outfits each morning, who managed the pearls and the toques and the brooches and the gloves, worked in conditions of such close physical proximity that they arguably knew her better than anyone alive. They saw her before the armour was on, before the public face had been assembled. Those early morning hours in the dressing room, when a dresser's hands were inches from the queen's neck, fastening pearls, adjusting collars, smoothing fabric. These were moments of an intimacy that in any other context might have bred familiarity, a softening, even friendship. It's happened in other royal households. It happens all the time. Not with Queen Mary. What the dressers reported was a woman no more relaxed in these intimate moments than she was in a state procession. The dressing was conducted with the same formality as everything else. Conversation, if it happened at all, was directed by Queen Mary and confined to practical matters. Which brooch, which toque, which gloves. Any attempt by a dresser to bridge the distance between servant and served, to venture a personal remark, to offer the kind of casual human warmth that makes long hours of close service bearable, was met with a withdrawal so immediate and total that it only needed to happen once. The lesson was absorbed permanently. You did not try again. You closed the distance physically each morning, fastening clasps and adjusting hems, and you maintained the emotional distance of a continent. That was the deal. Nobody explained it. Everybody understood it. And several household members noted something that complicates the portrait in a crucial way. She seemed genuinely unaware of the effect she had. It wasn't calculated cruelty. It wasn't a power play. It was that warmth, in her emotional vocabulary, simply didn't exist as an available register. The same incapacity her children had discovered at York Cottage now extended to everyone who entered her orbit. She wasn't choosing to freeze people out. She was frozen herself. Had been, it seemed, for as long as anyone could remember. Which brings us to the objects. Queen Mary's habit of acquiring things from other people's homes is probably her most famous quirk, and it's usually told as a funny little eccentricity, a charming royal foible, something to chuckle about over drinks. But if you shift the camera angle, if you look at it not from the biography shelf, but from below stairs, the comedy evaporates completely. Anne Edwards documented the pattern thoroughly in her 1984 biography, Matriarch, Queen Mary and the House of Windsor, and it followed a sequence so consistent that hosts and their servants could practically set a clock by it. Queen Mary would visit a country house. During her tour of the rooms, she'd pause before an object: porcelain, a Fabergé egg, a miniature, a snuff box, a piece of jade. She'd admire it, pick it up, turn it in her hands, comment on its quality, its provenance, its beauty. She'd hold it just a moment longer than was comfortable, set it down, move on to the next room as if nothing had happened. And the host would understand, with the absolute clarity of someone who knows the rules of a game they didn't choose to play, that the object had been marked. Social convention, deference, the sheer impossibility of refusing a queen who has expressed admiration for something in your home. All of it meant the object would, in due course, be wrapped, packaged, and sent to Queen Mary with a gracious note. She'd accept with a brief letter of thanks. Transaction complete. No money changed hands. None was offered. The social machinery did the work, and the machinery was frictionless because everyone, host, hostess, staff, understood that the cost of resistance was a royal displeasure nobody could afford. The word that eventually attached itself to this habit, kleptomania, isn't quite right, and the people who served her knew it. Kleptomania implies compulsion without awareness. Queen Mary was entirely aware. Her collection of Fabergé pieces grew to be among the finest private holdings in Britain, and she catalogued her acquisitions with the meticulousness of a museum curator. She knew exactly what she had. She knew exactly how she'd gotten it. The awareness was part of what made it so unsettling for the staff on both ends of the transaction. This wasn't impulse, it was system. But here's what nobody talks about: the servants. On both sides. It was the staff of the host household who had to identify the admired object after Queen Mary's departure. They'd watched her tour the rooms, they'd noted which piece she'd lingered over, which she'd turned in her gloved hands with that particular quality of attention. After the royal car pulled away, they'd go to that room, lift the object from its accustomed place, a place it may have occupied for decades, a place that now had a gap. Wrap it carefully, arrange its transport to Marlborough House or wherever the Queen was residing. Then they'd present the wrapped parcel to their employer for the drafting of the accompanying note. The whole process choreographed like a ritual everyone understood and nobody acknowledged. On the receiving end, Queen Mary's own household staff took delivery. They catalogued each acquisition, found a place for it in rooms already dense with objects, the accumulated yield of decades of country house visits. They maintained the polite fiction that each item represented a spontaneous act of generosity by a devoted subject, rather than what it actually was. And the staff on both sides, the ones wrapping and the ones unwrapping, understood perfectly well what was happening. They discussed it, of course, in the corridors in kitchens and service quarters, where royal servants have always conducted the real conversations of palace life. They had words for it. Some of those words were unkind. None of them were wrong. When you're the person wrapping up someone else's Fabergé egg because your employer admired it in that particular tone of voice, you're participating in something you cannot refuse, cannot name, and cannot discuss above stairs. The comedy that attaches to the anecdote in a biography, "Oh, you had to hide the good china when Queen Mary visited," isn't funny when you're the one who had to do the hiding, or the one who had to hand it over when the hiding failed. George V died on the 20th of January, 1936, and then came the thing that should have broken her, the abdication crisis of December 1936, her eldest son, Edward VIII, renouncing the throne to Mary Wallis Simpson, was, by every account, a devastating blow. The woman who couldn't express feelings to her own children was now confronted with a son who had expressed his feelings so extravagantly that he'd upended the monarchy to follow them. The irony must have been excruciating. But what the household staff witnessed wasn't devastation. What they saw was control, a visible hardening, a compression of emotion into something so dense and so contained it seemed to generate its own gravity. She didn't weep in front of the staff. She didn't rage. She didn't throw things or collapse into a chair or ask to be left alone. She drew herself tighter, straighter, more impenetrable than before, and the household understood. Not because she told them. She never told anyone anything. That whatever she felt about what her son had done, she would process it in some sealed interior chamber that no one would ever be permitted to enter. Not her ladies-in-waiting, not her remaining sons, not Maybelle Airlie, not anyone. The staff saw the aftermath in the quality of the silences that followed, a coldness that intensified perceptibly in the weeks after the abdication, a rigidity of routine that tightened like a hand closing around something precious and breakable. If she'd been difficult to serve before December 1936, she became something closer to impenetrable afterward. The withdrawals lasted longer. The erasures cut deeper. The already narrow bandwidth of human warmth she'd been capable of seemed to contract further, as though the betrayal, and she did consider it a betrayal, had confirmed something she'd always suspected about the danger of feeling anything at all. And then the war came, and Queen Mary descended on Badminton. In September 1939, she was evacuated from London to Badminton House in Gloucestershire, the estate of her niece Mary Somerset, Duchess of Beaufort. She arrived with a retinue that reportedly included over 60 servants and staff, a convoy of vehicles, and enough personal effects to furnish a small house within someone else's very large one. She would remain there for the duration of the war, nearly 6 years. And if you want to understand what it was like to serve Queen Mary, Badminton is where the picture comes into sharpest focus. Because here, installed in a household that wasn't hers, surrounded by staff who hadn't chosen her, operating in a countryside that had never seen anything quite like this descending upon it, every aspect of her character was amplified. She imposed her routines on Badminton with the same totality she'd brought to Buckingham Palace and Marlborough House. The day had a structure, and the structure was hers, and the Beaufort household staff found themselves absorbed into it, whether they liked it or not. The Duchess of Beaufort, who was, after all, the actual mistress of Badminton, found her authority over her own home quietly but completely overridden. Queen Mary rearranged rooms. She reorganized the running of the household to suit her preferences. She set the schedule. She determined who sat where and when and how. The Duchess, by multiple accounts, bore this with a grace that must have cost her considerably, because the alternative, confronting a dowager queen in her own drawing room, simply didn't exist as an option within the social universe these people inhabited. But Queen Mary's most famous Badminton habit was the wooding. She organized daily expeditions. Her staff, estate workers, sometimes reluctant members of the Beaufort household, to clear undergrowth, hack down ivy, remove fallen branches and dead wood from the estate's grounds and surrounding areas. She commanded these operations with the authority of a general directing a campaign, standing in the fields in her toque and pearls, because of course she wore her toques and pearls. She wore them everywhere. She would have worn them to the end of the world, pointing her walking stick at the next stretch of overgrowth to be attacked. The staff who accompanied her on these expeditions worked in all weather, cold, wet, mud up to the ankles. Queen Mary, wrapped in furs against the Gloucestershire winter, supervised from a position of slightly elevated ground, and the image is so perfectly, absurdly her. The immovable figure in the improbable hat, directing manual labor from a safe distance, that it almost obscures the reality of what it felt like for the people holding the saws. They didn't volunteer for this. They were assigned. The wooding expeditions weren't suggestions. They were the program for the day, and the program was set by Queen Mary, and that was that. Local landowners whose hedgerows and copses bordered the Badminton estate learned that Queen Mary's definition of clearing was rather more expansive than they might have preferred. She cleared with enthusiasm. She cleared with conviction. She cleared land that, strictly speaking, she had no particular right to clear, and the people whose land it was didn't complain, because you didn't complain to Queen Mary. Not about anything. Not ever. The wooding went on, season after season, year after year, and the staff who swung the axes and hauled the branches did so knowing that the 70-something-year-old woman watching from the hill would notice if their effort flagged, and that the consequences of flagging, the silence, the erasure, the terrible frost of her disapproval, were worse than any blister. And yes, the acquisition habit continued at Badminton. Wartime didn't slow it down. If anything, the country setting provided fresh territory. Queen Mary visited neighboring estates and returned with her observations about their contents. Objects were admired. The machinery engaged. Country houses in the Gloucestershire countryside that had survived centuries of English history found themselves contributing to Queen Mary's collection for no better reason than that their owner had been insufficiently quick to hide the good pieces before the royal car arrived. She returned to Marlborough House after the war. The routine continued. The staff served, the staff observed, the staff remembered. Queen Mary died peacefully in her sleep at Marlborough House on the 24th of March, 1953. She was 85 years old. Her granddaughter Elizabeth's coronation was 10 weeks away. She'd left instructions that the ceremony should not be postponed on her account, duty extending beyond death, as though her last act as a royal figure was to ensure she caused no inconvenience by dying. That was pure Queen Mary. The gesture was selfless and controlling at the same time, generous and imperious in equal measure. And the staff who carried out her final instructions probably recognized both qualities without any sense of contradiction. They'd lived with both for years. And then, slowly, the people who'd served her began to talk. Pope-Hennessy came with his notebook and his patience. He understood that these interviews required a particular kind of listening, the kind that lets silence do the work, that doesn't rush past discomfort, that signals to a former servant that it's safe, finally, to say what they actually thought rather than what they were trained to say. What he uncovered, in conversation after conversation with household staff, ladies-in-waiting, dressers, and those who'd attended her person and her security, was a portrait so at odds with the public monument that it must have startled even a biographer who'd expected complications. The word sour surfaced. Harsher words surfaced too. Language that wouldn't survive a drawing room, assessments that carried the blunt force of decades of suppressed opinion finally finding an outlet. And the consistency of the testimony was what gave it authority. Not one disgruntled footman with a grudge. Person after person, from different levels of the household, from different decades of service, describing the same withdrawals, the same silences, the same terrifying precision of her displeasure. That's not gossip. That's evidence. Pope-Hennessy published his official biography in 1959. Authorized. Smoothed. The raw interview material, the unvarnished voices of the servants, stayed hidden. It took Hugo Vickers, working with the Pope-Hennessy estate, until 2018 to bring those notes to print in The Quest for Queen Mary. And the world finally got to hear what the staff had actually said, unfiltered, unpolished, decades after the woman they'd served had turned to history. So what do we do with all this? Here's what we don't do. We don't use it to diminish her. That would be cheap, and it would be wrong, and it would miss the entire point of what the testimony actually reveals. Because the staff accounts don't describe a fraud. They don't expose a warm woman who pretended to be cold for public consumption. They describe something far more interesting and far more human than that. The woman who couldn't embrace her children, and the woman who held the monarchy together through an abdication crisis. They weren't two different people wearing different faces. They were the same person. The coldness and the composure came from the same source. The iron dignity wasn't a performance laid over a warm heart that the public never saw. And the private severity wasn't a corruption of some truer, gentler self that existed somewhere underneath. They were fused, inseparable, two edges of the same blade. She was, as her own staff said, as sour as she looked, and she looked magnificent. The people who served her never forgot her. That's the part that gets lost when this material is reduced to tabloid gossip or royal trivia. Decades after Queen Mary was gone, decades, those former servants were still talking about her. Not with affection, exactly, but with something that might be more durable than affection, something closer to awe. The stunned, complicated recognition that they had spent their working lives in the orbit of someone genuinely formidable. Not kind, not warm, not grateful, not easy. Formidable. They saw her more clearly than the newsreels ever did, more clearly than the biographers who came after, more clearly, perhaps, than her own children, who were too close and too wounded to see her whole. The staff had the distance of service and the intimacy of proximity, that strange combination that only servants possess. And what they saw was not a saint, but it was someone worth remembering, someone they couldn't stop remembering, even when they tried. Subscribe for more stories like this one.